After rewatching The Devil's Rejects recently for the first time in years, I was reminded of just how brutal horror had gotten in the mid-2000s, and 9/11 usually gets blamed for why these movies went to such sadistic places, but the real reason horror got more extreme in the 2000s goes a lot deeper than just one day, or even just one decade. Welcome to the Cinema Cult. I'm CT, and before I get into the brutal horror of the 2000s, I gotta talk about the 1990s. Now, it may be hard to imagine now, but back then, America was filled with optimism. The Cold War was over, and without the constant threat of nuclear Armageddon at a moment's notice, everyone could breathe a little bit easier. It kind of felt like we knew the rules. So that's why it's no surprise that a movie like Scream went on to define what horror would mean in the 1990s. This was a film that not only knew its own rules, but it also had no problem sharing those rules with the audience. Longtime horror fans reveled in seeing these slasher tropes defined on the screen, and audiences new to horror were instantly brought in on the joke. In other words, it traded terror for entertainment.
No, please don't kill me, Mr. Ghostface. I want to be in the sequel.
And as someone who was lucky enough to be in high school in the late 90s, the movies that followed in Scream's wake, like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, and Final Destination in 2000, well, they were basically made for teenagers going out on dates. Cause yeah, there's gonna be some jump scares and a few frightening moments, but they're just not the kind of horror films that leave you with knotted up stomachs and feelings of dread. Because there is a huge difference between fright and dread. Fright's the jump scare that startles you for a moment and then passes, ultimately leaving you relieved. Dread, that's a feeling that stays with you, since ultimately it's an uneasiness with the very state of things. Now, mainstream horror movies in the 1990s were built around fright because they were produced in a more stable-seeming world, and that's a worldview audiences didn't want challenged. This is a far cry from horror audiences of previous decades, like in the 1970s, when they were turning out like zombie hordes for movies filled with nihilism and despair. And of course, there was good reason for that. As the 60s turned into the 70s, the United States was a nation on edge, largely thanks to the increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam. This was the first war to play out in front of a TV audience, and as the horrifying imagery piled up, the true costs of war became impossible to ignore. When you combine those images with a figurehead like Walter Cronkite concluding on air in '68 that the war was unwinnable, well, you've got a recipe for a very disillusioned population. American audiences were witnessing things on TV like they'd never seen before, and the old Hays Code appropriate movies weren't going to cut it any longer. And the movies that emerged from this moment would be massively influential on the brutal horror that was to come in the 2000s. And there's probably no movie that better represents the desperation of the new American reality like 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Tobe Hooper's horror classic wasn't the first movie with cannibalistic killers, but rarely had a film felt so downright mean before. The lack of a musical score, combined with the ominous opening narration, made Texas Chainsaw Massacre feel almost like a documentary, following these doomed youths as they drive into rural Texas, never to be seen alive again. The cannibalistic family are the perfect stand-ins for a forgotten America left behind by the modern world, with a family patriarch who is literally replaced at the slaughterhouse by a machine designed to kill more efficiently. Then there's the massive Leatherface, embodying the rage of the forgotten working man and lashing out to show society who the best killer really is. The horror of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is more than just this killer in a mask and his creepy family, and the movie almost goes out of its way to not answer the question as to whether this family is simply insane, or are they the product of a crumbling society that's forgotten them, driving them to insanity and depravity. Wes Craven is another filmmaker who made his mark directing shocking horror movies in the 1970s, first with the ultra-low-budget Last House on the Left, and again in 1977 with a film that shares more than a few similarities with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes. Craven's killer cannibal movie swaps out chainsaws hippie youths traveling across rural Texas for a suburban family, driving through the desert on their way to LA. The Hills Have Eyes takes this familiar setup, blends in some inspiration from the Scottish legend of Sonny Bean's cannibal clan, and then it starts going places even more depraved than Texas Chainsaw Massacre was willing to go. Dogs aren't safe, babies aren't safe, and if this suburban family wants to survive, they'll have to meet brutality with brutality, while trying to hold on to their own humanity in the process.
You fat juicy.
In 1968, Night of the Living Dead shocked audiences with scenes of flesh-eating zombies, foreshadowing the nihilism of 1970s horror. So it's only appropriate that George Romero would close out the 70s with his next zombie film, Dawn of the Dead. Despite the decade-long gap between the release of these two movies, Romero has Dawn pick up right where Night leaves off, this time following 4 survivors who've realized society is not going to survive this zombie threat. There's no help coming, and it's every person for themselves. So they steal a news copter and fly west, deciding to hold up in one of those newfangled indoor malls. Now, at its core, Dawn of the Dead is just as pessimistic and cynical as Night of the Living Dead, but Romero's approach in Dawn is different and features quite a few comedic moments to balance out the despair. This trick of bringing levity into the most horrific of situations helped plenty of 1980s horror movies slip past the MPAA with an R rating, but not Dawn of the Dead, because this was originally given the dreaded X rating, with the censor board demanding Romero make major cuts to get it to an R. Instead, he bet on the audience's desire for more bloody gore, released Dawn of the Dead unrated, and the rest is history.
When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk here.
Speaking of history, if you're watching this video, then you're probably already familiar with the events of September 11th, 2001, when a group of Al-Qaeda hijackers took out the Twin Towers and part of the Pentagon. That, of course, led to really awesome things like the Patriot Act and the War on Terror, which basically turned into Vietnam Part 2, Desert Boogaloo. This whole thing left a pretty cynical taste in the mouths of America's youth, aka horror's biggest audience, and we were ready for a more visceral experience in the theaters. Now, one of the first movies to take advantage of this was a British movie, 28 Days Later, which is famous not just for rebooting the zombie subgenre with its alarmingly fast infected, but also for being filmed with digital video cameras that shot in standard definition. It gave the film an ugly look that perfectly fit the story's tone, and looked disturbingly similar to the low-res, pixelated videos out there on early internet shock sites like Rotten.com or Ogrish, because you can't tell the story of 2000s horror without getting into the internet of the early 2000s. Maybe it's because some people would rather not remember, but the internet was very different 25 years ago. It was a weird and far less regulated place filled with niche message boards and shocking websites. It's where I first learned the lesson that some things can never be unseen. Now, for the first time, anyone curious enough could go out and find all sorts of truly gruesome imagery depicting death and brutality and some of the worst that humanity had to offer. Rotten.com is probably the most famous of the early 2000s shock sites, and it was known for hosting gory and death-filled images sent in by the site's visitors. Many of these shock sites existed before the War on Terror broke out, but war meant more gruesome content for these sites, and their popularity grew. So, what does this all have to do with the movies? Well, apparently Eli Roth was spending some time digging through the darker corners of the internet, since he's actually claimed Hostel was inspired by a website that would give anyone with $10,000 to spend the opportunity to kill a person. Now, chances are that that site wasn't legitimate, but the point still stands that images and ideas which would have been considered too shocking for public consumption just a few years earlier were now easily available to anyone with an internet connection. And this shift fundamentally changed horror audiences because, well, no one had to wonder what a severed limb looked like anymore. But I am getting a little ahead of myself because Hollywood wasn't quick to jump on audiences' changing tastes, and it took a few years for the brutality to fully get its claws into mainstream horror. The Blair Witch Project was the surprise hit of the late 90s, but its success at the box office was largely thanks to a marketing campaign that simply couldn't be replicated. Then, In the wake of 9/11, there was a scramble to sanitize everything. Famously, there was the Spider-Man trailer and poster prominently featuring the Twin Towers, which were quickly removed. Even the band Jimmy Eat World renamed their recently released album from Bleed American to simply self-titled. But the problem was, we didn't want that sort of fake comfort.
Howdy, folks. Like blood, violence, freaks of nature? Well, then, come on down.
Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses foreshadowed where the horror genre was headed when it was released in April of 2003, after biding its time for years in production hell when Universal shelved the film for being too extreme. Thankfully, Lionsgate eventually jumped in to distribute Zombie's grindhouse-inspired throwback, and the timing couldn't have been any better, because insane killer families turned out to be a big theme for horror in the coming years. And not just any kind of insane killer families, but specifically ones directly inspired by the brutal horror movies of the 1970s. The parallels are undeniable. In 2003, America was once again embroiled in a war against an idea. Meanwhile, you've got brutal imagery flooding shock sites with new horrors available to curious internet browsers every day. So it was a case of twin movies in the spring of 2003, tempering these American anxieties into something new but familiar. House of a Thousand Corpses came first, and it's Rob Zombie's take on a Texas Chainsaw Massacre inspired story, injected with his music video aesthetics and chaotic editing. Then, just weeks later, Wrong Turn hit theaters. This one takes just as much inspiration from The Hills Have Eyes as it does Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and there are some core plot points that all these movies share. That is, young travelers having some car trouble out in unfamiliar territory, where they're eventually trapped, tortured, and killed by a rural family of psychopaths or mutants. But the biggest backwoods killer this year was yet to come. Meanwhile, in the UK, Danny Boyle was reinventing the zombie film with 28 Days Later, which finally released in the US in June and might be one of the most perfect examples of a film refreshing old ideas for a new generation. Now, I already mentioned how the choice to shoot on digital cameras produced footage that reminded us of the gruesome realities that we were seeing online. This movie also had new, faster, and much more terrifying zombies with The Infected, but despite all these updates, 28 Days Later knew that sometimes it just makes sense to rip off a classic scene. And of course, I'm talking about when the group stops to gas up their taxi and Jim ends up killing an infected child to defend himself. It's almost the exact same chain of events as in Romero's Dawn of the Dead, when the group stops to refuel their chopper and Peter is attacked by a pair of zombie children who he has to gun down. 28 Days Later wasn't just taking inspiration from Dawn of the Dead's nihilism, it was cribbing scenes directly from the source, and suddenly, zombies were scary as hell once again. But 2003 wasn't over yet, and that October, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake was unleashed at theaters, where it made over $100 million against a budget of less than $10 million, proving that there was real demand for horror films that took themselves more seriously and weren't afraid to get properly brutal in the process. The 1-2 punch of 28 Days Later and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake pushed mainstream horror in a nihilistic direction, and all of a sudden, 70s-inspired, ruthless horror was fashionable again, particularly when there were zombies or backwoods killers involved. In the next few years saw a number of remakes and reimaginings of old horror properties updated to match the attitudes of a 2000s-era audience. Some of these were more successful than others. 2004's Dawn of the Dead from writer James Gunn and director Zack Snyder is one of the more well-regarded remakes from this era. It kept the original's basic story of a group of zombie apocalypse survivors holing up in a mall, but updated the zombies themselves to be much faster and more vicious than the traditional Romero-style zombie. The 28 Days Later influence is undeniable. But maybe the most important thing that Dawn of the Dead kept was the nihilism of the original, and it purposefully ends on a note that gives the audience no hope that there's any humanity left. I also have to acknowledge the famously vicious Saw franchise kicking off in October of 2004. Saw was an instant hit and another example of a ruthless horror movie making over $100 million at the box office. Now, unlike most of these other films, Saw took as much inspiration from independent cinema of the 90s like Pi and the Blair Witch Project as it did the horror of the 1970s. And just like Rob Zombie, the makers of Saw had some difficulty getting their film idea off the ground, That is, until they took it to Hollywood and were welcomed into the budding trend of brutal horror with open arms. And this franchise would continue with 9 more Saw sequels over the next 2 decades, making it maybe the most commercially successful idea that came out of this wave of 2000s horror. And with all that success, you'd think the genre would keep chasing Saw's formula, but that didn't really happen. And the movie that started me down this whole path would end up hitting theaters less than a year later, while only making a fraction of what Saw made. But it did somehow win over at least one unlikely critic. But real quick, if you're finding any of this interesting, make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons. If you're familiar with my channel, you know this is a pretty big departure from my usual list videos, so I also want to know if you're digging this new format, or if you're not. Either way, let me know about it in the comments. Now, getting back into this trend of 70s inspired brutality, you might remember this whole journey back through 2000s horror started after I rewatched Rob Zombie's The Devil's Rejects, figuring it was time for a reevaluation after all these years. Because the truth is, The Devil's Rejects is not a movie I liked all that much upon release, and I wasn't alone, because while all these other 70s inspired horror movies were clearing $100 million at the box office, The Devil's Rejects barely made over $20 million. So what gives? Why wasn't this movie printing money like the rest of this wave of horror? Rob Zombie helped kick off this brutal trend just a few years earlier, and The Devil's Rejects is just as vicious and depraved as the rest of these other movies. It also isn't shy about its retro influences, but it still just wasn't connecting with those wider audiences. And that may be because The Devil's Rejects didn't deal with anonymous killers stalking from the shadows, but instead presents the Firefly family in all their weird, depraved glory. And this approach requires a certain amount of campiness to work, meaning The Devil's Rejects has its share of darkly comedic moments.
What's the matter, kid? Don't you like clowns?
This is a significant change from the other brutal films in this era, where the villains are basically anonymous vessels for violence. And sure, they all have their individual motivations and reasons for killing, but those tended to be surface-level justifications for the gratuitous violence depicted in these films, rather than an attempt at dissecting the villain's motivations. And maybe it was from watching all that anonymous violence online, but young horror fans of the mid-2000s were specifically looking for a more in-your-face style of violent horror, with no deeper message wanted or needed. And they certainly weren't looking for campiness to undercut that cruelty. Which brings me back to Eli Roth and that mysterious murder website that inspired his movie Hostel. This was a seriously dark film, and it took influences from 70s exploitation, Italian splatter, and extreme Japanese horror, but it may have gone a bit too far. Hostel is the classic example of a film that could be called torture porn, a movie that exists purely to shock and disturb, with depictions of cruel violence as its primary selling point. In many ways, it's the logical end of this trend of brutality in mainstream horror, because the violence had finally reached the point where it met and even surpassed the gruesome realities being depicted on those early internet shock sites. The Hills Have Eyes remake released a few months later, and that gave us more of a proper ending to this cycle of ultra-violent mainstream horror. It was faithful to Wes Craven's original while upping the depictions of barbaric violence more than enough to meet the standards of the 2000s. It's gone on to be recognized as one of the better remakes of that decade, but it's also the last of these extreme horror films to make much mainstream impact outside of the Saw franchise. By October of 2006, a prequel to the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released, and it did less than half of the business of that 2003 movie. The trend was officially on its way out. Audiences had gotten their fill of brutal horror, and they were looking for new ways to be scared. A little movie named Paranormal Activity started making its rounds at various festivals in 2007, signaling the emergence of found footage as a new staple horror subgenre. But that's a story for another day. Going back to where all this began, with me watching the Firefly family go out in a blaze of glory as The Devil's Rejects concluded, it almost seems inevitable that this is the direction horror went in the mid-2000s. Horror is a genre that's constantly changing, and horror's biggest audience was seeing the world they knew change right before their very eyes. The 2000s wave of brutal horror is often maligned, but it was really important for my journey as a horror fan, and I actually started watching a lot more horror from the 1970s, specifically because of these films from the 2000s that were either direct remakes of 70s films or just drew a ton of inspiration from them. So whether or not you're a fan of this particular brand of brutal horror from the 2000s, I hope you can at least appreciate these films and their place in horror history. If you're familiar with my channel at all, you know this was a very different style of video for me. If you dig this new format, don't just hit the like and subscribe buttons, make sure to also let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, make sure you check out this list of my favorite horror movies from the 2000s right here. But that's it for today. I'm CT Reese. Thanks for hanging out with me and keep watching weird movies. I know I will.